I always thought I had him figured out. Jason, my best friend, my college roommate, my drinking buddy, the guy who would walk into a room and own it without trying. Tall, broad-shouldered, effortlessly confident. The kind of man who never had to chase after love because love always found him first. And of course he was straight. He made sure everyone knew that. And yet, I could never quite forget the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking, or how he always found an excuse to sit a little too close, his knee brushing against mine, his arm draping lazily over my shoulders. I told myself it didn't mean anything. I told myself I was imagining things. Then, that night happened. It started, like any other weekend. The city outside our apartment was alive with the distant hum of car horns and laughter spilling from late-night bars. Inside, our tiny living room was cluttered with half-empty beer bottles and the remains of a pizza we had devoured hours ago. Jason was on his third or maybe fourth whiskey, his laughter loose and unfiltered. You know, he slurred, pointing at me with an exaggerated wave of his hand. You're too uptight. You need to have more fun. I rolled my eyes. And, by fun, you mean getting blackout drunk and embarrassing myself? Exactly, he grinned, his eyes glinting under the dim glow of the lamp. I had seen Jason drunk before. I had seen him loud and reckless, stumbling home after a night out, rambling about some girl he barely remembered. But this was different. There was something about the way he was looking at me now, intense, searching, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't know existed. I shifted uncomfortably. I think you've had enough. He ignored me, leaning forward, closing the space between us. You ever think about it? He asked suddenly. My breath caught. Think about what? His gaze flickered down for the briefest moment, so quick, I almost missed it. But I felt it. The heat in my chest, the tightening in my throat. I swallowed hard. Jason exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Never mind, he murmured, leaning back against the couch, but I could see it in his eyes. Something left unsaid, hanging between us like a weight neither of us dared to touch. I should have let it go. I should have laughed it off, changed the subject, pretended like that moment hadn't happened. But I didn't. Instead, I asked, why? Have you? He didn't answer right away. His fingers tapped restlessly against his glass, his jaw tightening. Outside, the city pulsed with life. Inside, the air between us felt impossibly still. And in that silence, something shifted, something neither of us could take back. Jason didn't bring it up the next morning. I told myself it was just the alcohol talking, just another one of his careless comments that meant nothing. But something about the way he acted felt off. He was quieter than usual, more distracted. He barely looked at me as he made coffee, stirring his mug with slow, absent-minded movements. It wasn't like him. Jason was the kind of guy who always had something to say, who filled the silence with laughter, stories, or playful jabs. But today, it was different. I could have ignored it. I could have let it go, but I didn't. About last night, my voice came out quieter than I expected. Jason's stirring stopped. For a moment, I thought he was going to pretend he hadn't heard me. But then, without turning around, he said, "Forget it." I frowned. Forget it? Yeah. He finally looked at me, his face unreadable. We were drunk. It was nothing. Nothing. The words stung in a way I didn't understand. Right, I muttered, forcing a laugh. Of course, just drunk talk. Jason nodded, taking a sip of his coffee, but his grip on the mug was tight, knuckles white. The tension lingered between us for days, like an unspoken question neither of us was brave enough to ask. It should have faded, but it didn't. And then, it happened again. The party was louder than I liked. Some rooftop get-together Jason had dragged me to, insisting I needed to get out more. I stood by the railing, nursing a beer, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Jason, as always, was in the center of the action, laughing too loud, drink in hand, his arms slung over some girl's shoulder. The sight shouldn't have bothered me. It never had before. But then, as if sensing my gaze, Jason's eyes met mine across the crowd, and he froze. It lasted only a second, but in that moment, the rest of the party faded. The noise, the music, the laughter, it was all background static. Then he looked away, turning his attention back to the girl, whispering something in her ear that made her laugh. I exhaled sharply, tearing my gaze away. "Not your scene." The voice was deep, smooth, with the hint of a smile hidden behind it. I turned to find a guy standing next to me, tall, lean, with sharp features and dark, intelligent eyes. He held a whiskey in one hand, his posture relaxed but curious. I blinked. Yeah, not really." He chuckled. "Figured. You've had that same beer for the last hour." I glanced at the bottle in my hand, heat creeping up my neck. Guess I'm not good at pretending to have fun. The guy smirked, taking a slow sip of his drink. Neither am I. There was something about him, something different from Jason's. Loud, chaotic energy. He was composed, effortless, like he didn't need to try to hold someone's attention. "What's your name?" I asked. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Eli. Eli. Simple, strong." It suited him. I nodded. I know who you are." His gaze flickered toward Jason, still lost in the crowd. "You're his best friend." There was something in his voice I couldn't place. Something knowing, something careful. I swallowed. "Yeah." Eli tilted his head, studying me for a moment. Then he smiled, small but unmistakable. "Interesting." He clinked his glass against my beer bottle before turning to walk away, disappearing into the crowd. I watched him go, my heart hammering in my chest for reasons I didn't fully understand. And when I glanced back at Jason, I found him staring at me again. But this time, he wasn't smiling. I didn't expect to see Eli again. The party had felt like a strange, fleeting moment, one of those passing encounters that leave an impression, but fade into memory with time. But then, 2 nights later, I ran into him again. At my usual bar. He was sitting alone at the counter, fingers idly tracing the rim of a whiskey glass. The same quiet confidence, the same effortless presence. Like he belonged there. Like he knew exactly who he was. Unlike me, I hesitated at the door. I could have walked away. I could have pretended I didn't see him. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself walking straight toward him. Eli glanced up as I sat down next to him, an amused smirk already forming on his lips. "Didn't take you for a whiskey guy." "I'm not," I admitted, waving the bartender over. "But I'm also not in the mood for beer." Eli hummed in approval. "Good answer." I ordered a drink, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The low hum of the bar surrounded us. Muffled conversations, the clink of glasses, the occasional burst of laughter. It was comfortable, unrushed, and then Eli leaned slightly closer. "So, tell me, what's it like?" I frowned. What like?" His gaze flickered toward the back of the bar, where Jason stood, laughing with a group of friends, completely unaware of us. Being his best friend, my chest tightened. It was such a simple question, but the weight of it settled in my stomach. Jason and I had known each other for years. We'd grown up together, shared everything, our wins, our failures, our worst secrets. He was the person I trusted most in the world, and yet lately, that trust felt complicated. I swallowed. I hesitated. "It's hard to explain." Eli studied me for a moment, as if he already knew what I wasn't saying, and then he smiled. "I think you just did." I didn't expect to see Eli again after that either, but I did. It became a pattern, a slow, unspoken routine. At first it felt like coincidence. I'd run into him at a coffee shop, at a bookstore, at another party I hadn't even planned on attending. Each time, the conversations got a little longer. The silences got a little more meaningful. And then, one night, it wasn't a coincidence anymore. I was walking home when I heard a voice behind me. Need a ride? I turned to find Eli leaning against his car, one hand casually resting on the door. I hesitated. How'd you know I was here? His lips twitched. Call it a hunch. I should have said no. I should have questioned it. But instead, I found myself sliding into the passenger seat, the scent of leather and cologne filling my senses. Eli didn't ask where I was going. He just drove. We didn't talk much at first, just the quiet hum of the engine, the occasional glance from the corner of my eye. But then, out of nowhere, Eli broke the silence. Have you ever wanted to leave? I frowned. Leave? This place, this city, everything you know. I blinked, caught off guard by the question. I don't know. I guess I've never really thought about it, Eli hummed, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel. You should. I studied him. You have, haven't you? His jaw tightened. Yeah. A beat of silence. Then softly, he said, sometimes, I think I wasn't meant for this life. I didn't know what to say to that. I wanted to ask what he meant, what he was running from, what he was searching for, but I didn't. Instead, I just watched the way his fingers gripped the wheel, the way his shoulders tensed as if he were carrying something too heavy to put into words. And for the first time, I realized something. Eli wasn't just confident. He wasn't just sure of himself. He was lonely. It wasn't always deep conversations. Sometimes it was just small things. The way Eli would brush against me when he reached for something. The way he'd let his fingers linger for just a second too long. The way I'd catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading into things that weren't there. But then one night, he proved me wrong. We were sitting on my couch, a half-empty bottle of whiskey between us, the city lights glowing through the window. Jason was out. It was just the two of us, and the tension was suffocating. Eli leaned forward, resting his elbow on his knee. So, I raised an eyebrow. So, his eyes locked onto mine, and then barely above a whisper, he said, Why do you let him get to you? I stiffened. I don't know what you're talking about. Eli exhaled a quiet laugh. Yeah, you do. Silence stretched between us. I swallowed. Jason's my best friend. Eli studied me for a long moment, and then, so softly it was almost nothing, he said, I think you wish he wasn't. My breath caught. Something shifted in the air. I didn't know if it was the alcohol, the late hour, the way his voice wrapped around me like something dangerous and warm all at once. But suddenly, Eli was too close. His knee brushed against mine. His hand hovered between us, fingers inches from my own. He didn't move. He was waiting. And for the first time in my life, I wanted. Wanted something I wasn't supposed to want. Wanted something I didn't understand. Wanted him. The moment stretched, fragile and delicate. Then, before I could decide what to do, before I could let myself fall, he pulled away. And just like that, the moment was gone, but not forgotten. Never forgotten. I told myself it was nothing. That moment between us, the almost touch, the almost confession, was just a trick of the alcohol, a mistake I'd imagined in the haze of the night. Eli had pulled away first. That meant something, didn't it? And yet, the next morning, I woke up with a tightness in my chest that wouldn't go away. I tried to shake it off. I needed to shake it off. But then, everything fell apart. Jason knew. I don't know how. Maybe he saw something in the way I looked at Eli. Maybe he'd sensed the shift in the air, the way my body tensed whenever Eli was around. Or maybe he had just always known, before I even knew myself. But one night, without warning, Jason pulled me aside. his face tight with something that looked like anger, or worse, betrayal. "You need to stop," he said. I blinked, caught off guard. "Stop what?" Jason exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You know what?" My stomach twisted. I forced out a laugh. "You're being ridiculous." But Jason didn't laugh. He just looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time, I felt exposed. "It's him, isn't it?" Jason's voice was quiet now, careful, like he was afraid of the answer. I swallowed. Don't lie to me, man." His voice cracked. "It's him." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. Jason let out a humorless chuckle. "I should have known. I mean, you always had a type, but this..." He shook his head. "He's just using you. You know that, right?" My chest tightened. "What the hell are you talking about?" Jason crossed his arms. "Eli, he's messing with you. You're a game to him." I flinched. Jason must have seen something in my face because his expression softened, just for a second. "Look, I get it," he said. "You're confused. Maybe you think you feel something, but trust me, he doesn't." I hated the way his words burrowed under my skin. Because wasn't that my biggest fear? That Eli was just playing with me? That all those touches, those stolen glances, meant nothing? Jason stepped closer. "You're my best friend. I don't want you to get hurt." And then, softly, carefully, he placed a hand on my shoulder. And I hated myself for the way I almost leaned into it. I felt safe with Jason. He was familiar, steady, normal. Eli was none of those things, and yet. Jason sighed. "Just let this go, okay?" He was giving me a way out, a choice. I could pretend Eli meant nothing. I could walk away before I got in too deep. And for a moment, I almost did. But then, a few nights later, I saw Eli again. It was raining. Hard. Was supposed to go home. But instead, I found myself standing outside his apartment, heart pounding. The door opened before I could even knock. Eli stood there, shirt rumpled, eyes dark and unreadable. For a second, we just stared at each other, rain dripping from my hair onto his doorstep. Then he sighed. "Come inside." I stepped in, shaking off the cold. Eli didn't say anything. He just walked to the kitchen, poured himself a drink, and leaned against the counter. "I saw you with Jason," he said. I froze. Eli's lips curled, but there was no humor in it. "Did he warn you about me?" I swallowed hard. "Eli..." "Did he?" I hesitated. "Too long." Eli exhaled a laugh, shaking his head. "Of course he did." My stomach twisted. It's fine," Eli interrupted, voice tight. "Jason's your best friend. You trust him." I opened my mouth to argue, but Eli just looked at me. His jaw tense, his shoulders rigid, like he was waiting for me to say something, like he already knew I wouldn't. And I hated myself for it. Because in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean if I admitted the truth. Afraid of what it would mean if I let myself want him. And Eli must have seen it on my face, because his expression shuttered. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "I'm not going to beg, you know." I flinched. It's fine." He set down his glass. "I get it." I took a step closer. "Eli, wait." But he was already turning away, already pulling back. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe I'd already lost him. I told myself I wouldn't go back. I'd stood in Eli's apartment, seen the way his eyes darkened with hurt. And still, I hadn't been able to say the words he needed to hear. I had let fear win. And now, it was too late. Or at least, that's what I thought. It had been days. Days of silence. Of avoiding his name in conversations. Of pretending I wasn't checking my phone every 5 minutes like some desperate idiot. Jason must have thought he'd won. He never said anything outright, but I could feel it in the way he acted. Lighter, like a weight had been lifted. But all I felt was the crushing sense that I had made the wrong choice. And then the call came. I was at a bar, alone, nursing a drink I barely touched. The TV above the counter was playing the news on low volume, and I was only half listening when I heard his name. My body froze. I turned to the screen just in time to see the wreckage. Twisted metal, flashing red and blue lights, rain slicking, the pavement, a car accident. My chest caved in. I didn't even think. I just ran. By the time I got to the hospital, my heart was in my throat. Eli was alive. That was the only thing keeping me from unraveling completely. But he wasn't okay. A nurse directed me to his room, and when I stepped inside, the sight of him nearly knocked the air out of my lungs. He looked so small. Eli, who was always so put together, so effortlessly confident, was now lying in a hospital bed, his face pale, his arm in a sling, a bandage over his forehead. His eyes flickered open when he heard me. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then, his lips curled into something that barely resembled a smirk. "Didn't think you'd show up," he murmured, voice hoarse, swallowed hard. "Yeah, well, you scared the shit out of me." He let out a breath, looking away. Something about that, about the way he wouldn't meet my eyes, broke me, because I knew why. I had hurt him. I had made him feel like he was nothing to me, but that was a lie. I took a slow step forward. Eli. He didn't move, didn't say anything. I sat down beside him, hesitating only a second before I reached out, just enough for my fingers to brush against his. His breath hitched. "I was wrong," I whispered. Eli didn't pull away. Didn't speak. But I could feel the tension in his body, the way he was holding himself still, waiting. I took a shaky breath. I was afraid, I admitted, of what it would mean, of what people would think, of what Jason would think. My voice cracked. "But I don't care anymore." Eli turned to me then, his expression unreadable. I swallowed. "I don't care, Eli. Not if it means losing you." His eyes softened, and for the first time in days, he looked at me like I was his again. "You're an idiot," he muttered. A breathless laugh escaped me. "Yeah, I know." Eli exhaled slowly. Then, after a long pause, he squeezed my hand. It was small, subtle, but it was enough. It was everything. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't running anymore. Not from him. Not from this. Not from us. The rain had stopped by the time we left the hospital. The city was damp, the streets shining under the glow of streetlights, and the air smelled like fresh beginnings. Eli walked beside me, his arm still in a sling, but there was something different about him now. Lighter, as if the weight between us had finally lifted. I knew what I had to do. We reached his apartment building, and I hesitated only for a second before grabbing his good hand, stopping him before he could climb the steps. He turned to me, questioning. I took a deep breath. "I want to be with you, Eli. No more hiding, no more fear." His eyes searched mine, as if waiting for hesitation, waiting for me to flinch. But I didn't. Because for the first time, I wasn't afraid. "I love you," I said, the words raw and unguarded. "And I want everyone to know." Eli inhaled sharply. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his lips, small at first, then radiant. "Say it again," he murmured. I stepped closer, gripping his hand tighter. "I love you." His breath hitched. Then, before I could say anything else, he pulled me in, not caring that we were standing in front of his building, not caring who might see. His lips met mine, and it was everything. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a promise, a declaration, a homecoming. When we finally pulled apart, Eli's forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. Took you long enough, he whispered, laughing softly. I chuckled, my heart light. Yeah, well, you were worth the wait. And for the first time in a long time I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. With him. With us. Together.